This week on Life and Faith.
Flourishing is all aspects of a person's life are good, including the contexts and communities in which they live. So the community's well-being is part of one's own flourishing.
When you trust that another person is doing their best, you're going to give them the benefit of the doubt.
None of us can guarantee staying somewhere forever.
Cognitive ability became what I call the gold standard of human esteem.
If I try being normal, what is it like?
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart. What does it mean to truly flourish as a person? What are the ingredients of a life that would increase the chances of us thriving as people? Now, policymakers are interested in this question, so are educationalists, and as individuals, it's a topic that we all do well to think about. People these days are very focused on well-being and what will aid our well-being or hinder it. My guest today spends a lot of time thinking about this, and he is in a very good position to offer reflections on this topic, some of which might come as a surprise. VanderWeele is Professor of Epidemiology in the Departments of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the Harvard School of Public Health. He's also the Director of the Human Flourishing Program. Now, I don't normally do this, but just so you know the kind of person we're dealing with here, he holds degrees from the University of Oxford, the University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard University in mathematics, philosophy, theology, finance, and biostatistics. His empirical research spans psychiatric and social epidemiology, the science of happiness and flourishing, and the study of religion and health. His research in this area of human flourishing covers very large data sets to give broad but accurate measurements of what factors contribute to human flourishing. VanderWeele was here in Sydney as a guest of the Scots College, where he delivered their annual Clark Lecture, among other things. I began our conversation by asking for a definition. What does he mean by human flourishing?
So the working definition we've been using for flourishing at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard is living in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good.
Right.
So very broad.
That is broad.
Very all-encompassing. Understood this way, flourishing is really an ideal. It's something we never perfectly attain here and now. And it's also multidimensional. We can be flourishing in certain ways and not others. It covers all aspects of a person's life. So we often try to look at some of the major domains of human life when we're thinking about flourishing, things that everyone seems to desire, that are sought for their own sake. So things like happiness. People want to be happy. So I would say happiness is an important domain. Health is an important domain of flourishing. And these are important things, but people want more than that. People also want to have a sense of meaning and purpose. They want to be a good person. They want to have good relationships. And so we look across these domains: happiness, health, meaning, character, close social relationships. And while I don't think all of that captures all of flourishing, I think each of those domains are important. So that's often where we begin.
Yeah, it's really important to capture the multi-dimensional aspect of the human person, because we are very much that. We're not just one thing, are we? And there's so many things that would contribute to our sense of either flourishing or not. Before we get into some more of that detail, what got you interested in this subject in the first place? What gets you excited about this topic?
Yeah, so it really came out of research I had been doing on religious service attendance and health, and we found these powerful effects on decreasing depression, increasing life expectancy, lowering the risk of suicide. And I thought these are important effects on outcomes that we deeply care about. Why aren't we studying these things more often? And so that led me to think about what else is shaping population health that we're ignoring. So it brought me to some work on parenting practices, some work on forgiveness. But then I started thinking, what outcomes are we ignoring? We study health very well, we study income very well, and these are important. But again, people care about more than that. They want to be happy. They want to have good relationships. They want to do what's right. They want to have meaning and purpose. Why aren't we studying these other aspects of human well-being with the same level of rigor that we study health and income? why do we know so much more about the determinants, say, of cardiovascular disease than what gives rise to a sense of meaning and purpose in life, despite that being a desired goal for just about everyone? And so that's what led me 8 years ago now to found the Human Flourishing program at Harvard, to try to study these other aspects of flourishing, of human well-being, in ways that we do with health and with income.
This area has become such a focus for even economists, hasn't it, and politicians. And there's a whole lot of people now saying, oh, we can measure things like GDP, but that's not going to cut it. We need more than this. What's been the reaction to and the response to your centre, forming this body to do this investigation?
I think for the most part, there's been considerable interest. There's been interest from businesses interested in promoting well-being in the workplace and the effect that that has on business outcomes as well. There's been interest within education and making flourishing perhaps the aim of education. There's certainly been interest within the academic world as well, and trying to look at more positive outcomes and within public health, not just health and disease states, but these broader aspects of well-being. As you indicated, there's also interest from policymakers. We've recently been contacted by the state of Tennessee, which is thinking about allowing for evaluation of all their social welfare programs in terms of flourishing. So I'm encouraged to see movement in this direction. There has been interest from economists as well. Many of them want to focus just on life satisfaction and have kind of a single measure to supplement GDP. And I think there can be some advantages of doing that from a policy perspective, but I don't think it captures all of flourishing. Again, if we're thinking of flourishing as all aspects of a person's life are good, then yes, happiness and life satisfaction is important, but it's not capturing some of those nuances. It's not necessarily capturing the nature of social relationships or meaning and purpose. So, for example, one finds that levels of happiness and life satisfaction are higher in richer developed countries than poor developing countries. But the reverse is the case with meaning and purpose. Meaning and purpose is higher in poor developing countries than rich developed countries, which should give us a moment of pause to ask, how can we carry out economic development in ways that don't compromise meaning and purpose? So while I'm all for assessing happiness and life satisfaction, I think if we're trying to understand flourishing, we need to look more broadly. We need to look at all aspects of a person's life.
Are we doing, let's say in the sort of affluent West, you have levels of happiness, but meaning and purpose might be lacking. On the flourishing kind of scale and measurements and things, are we doing worse than we once did, do you think? Or is it easy to tell? Or what's your sense of it?
That's a good question. A difficult question with regard to rigorous data. While we've been tracking health measures for decades and decades, and same with income and GDP, measures of flourishing have only been collected more recently. So if one takes something as important as social connectedness and loneliness, say, yes. We do know loneliness has been increasing the last decade or so. But if you go back further than that, there's not all that great data. It would suggest that loneliness maybe started increasing a few decades back, but that data has been reasonably challenged. And so we don't definitively know.
But we do know that people are lonely. So you've mentioned in lots of different areas how social connectedness and loneliness is becoming, it's an increasing problem. And it is among younger people too, not just older people languishing in nursing homes, say. This is fascinating to me, the loneliness of the younger generation. Is this something that you're coming across?
Yeah, certainly we are. We're seeing this in our data, and really not just loneliness. We're seeing across these aspects of flourishing that young people aren't doing as well as they used to be. Many of the earlier studies on happiness and life satisfaction suggested a U-shaped curve with age, with those who are younger and those who are older, tending to report greater levels of happiness and life satisfaction. Those in midlife, perhaps struggling with young children and aging parents and career challenges, again, often reporting lower levels of life satisfaction. But what we've seen over time is that left part of the U has been flattening. Young people aren't doing as well as they used to be. This started even before the COVID-19 pandemic, but was exacerbated by it. And in the United States, in 2022, for the first time, we saw each of those dimensions of flourishing strictly increasing in age. Right. Young people were doing the poorest. That applied to happiness with regard to self-rated health, meaning, character, and social relationships. So yes, young people were much lonelier than others, but also not doing as well in these other areas. And actually, we find similar patterns in Australia as well. If we look at composite assessments of flourishing, the young people aren't doing as well. So I think this is a real cause for concern.
It really is, isn't it? And do you have any sense of the reasons for this?
Yeah, the data we have doesn't tell us exactly why this is taking place, but we can kind of put pieces together. And, I don't think it is just one thing. I think there are several influences. Certainly many point to social media use, and I think good evidence now that excessive social media use does lower well-being. And if you look at the average levels amongst young people today, it's extremely high. I think especially for young women, this seems to have a very negative effect on mental health. So I think trying to find ways to navigate that is important. I do think some of the story is economic opportunities and young people feeling they don't have the same sorts of opportunities as their parents. Housing markets being extraordinarily expensive. How can I afford a family
I don't know
today?
if you know much about real estate in Australia and here in Sydney, but yeah, that's huge. And every day in the newspapers it's talked about. So young people, that's a very big blocker.
So I think that's another factor. I think also a sense of existential threat and crisis from the COVID-19 pandemic to concerns about global warming to wars breaking out. And of course, this is affecting everyone, but older generations have often had a longer period of stability. And for young adults today, this is sort of the only world that they've experienced, that they've known. I do think another factor is the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic itself. And while that certainly had adverse effects on everyone, I think it disproportionately affected young people. With regard to social relationships, for example, while the lockdown restrictions were difficult for everyone, for those who already had relationships and communities, you could kind of carry on as best as possible through Zoom or telephone or other media. But for those who are young, who are trying to form relationships, who are trying to enter into communities, that long period of restriction, I think made things extremely difficult during the most critical time where this was to take place. So I do think the pandemic and the way we handled the pandemic had a big effect on the well-being of young adults. I think there are also broader societal trends that have negatively affected the well-being of young adults. The declining rates of marriage, I think, have affected well-being, and also the declining rates of religious participation, which likewise, study after study has suggested very important for numerous aspects of flourishing. And so I think those trends likewise have contributed to lower well-being amongst youth. So I don't think there is one single explanation, but I think all of these factors have come into play.
And there's a couple of those that I want to come back to and press you a bit more on. But thinking about social media and connectedness, so we can talk about being connected and yet very lonely. Why are flesh and blood interactions so important to us as human beings?
Yeah, I mean, some fundamental level concerning human nature, I think we are embodied. We are not just minds interacting with one another, but we are physical beings. And so I think being present with others is important for acknowledging that and for building that sense of connection. I think also when one is face to face with another person, it becomes easier to share. It becomes easier to feel that you are beginning to get to know them. And it becomes easier to have much longer, deeper conversations when we're restricted to short messages via social media. There's only so much that can be expressed, and often much of that is very public, and so it becomes difficult to share what is more intimate. And there are often concerns about coming under attack or criticism, or how what one says might be perceived by others. That simply don't arise in quite the same way with face-to-face connections. So again, I think the studies suggest when we are with people face-to-face, our happiness, our well-being tends to go up. And when we're communicating through virtual channels, not in all, but in most contexts, well-being goes down. So I really think we need a shift away from online modes of communication and quote-unquote connection to being present with others and to being in community with others. So there's been a lot of change in that regard over the past decades, and I think we need to recapture that sense of community and social connection.
Let's talk about community, because we often talk about community being so crucial to who we are as human beings and yeah, indeed our flourishing. Community is hard work though, isn't it? It costs you something. You have to invest something for community to work really well. And I wonder if our world of sort of instant gratification from social media, that type of interaction, counts against us being willing to pay the price, that the rewards of community will come if we're willing to pay.
I think that is the case, and that is part of the story. I do think there's been some very good work in positive psychology on how to increase happiness and improve health, kind of gratitude exercises, acts of kindness exercises, and so on and so forth. But what's interesting about those is it tends to improve happiness, improve health, but doesn't affect some of those other flourishing domains in quite a profound way. It doesn't really affect purpose or character or social relationships in the same way. And I think for these other aspects of flourishing, we need longer-term commitments. We need communities. We need participation in institutions. And the evidence suggests those communal commitments really do affect all of these different elements of flourishing. But as you indicated, that can be hard work. Often it requires commitments. It requires showing up even when you might not feel like it. It can require working through difficult relationships. It can require putting up with aspects of the community life that you don't particularly like. But it turns out that working through those challenges is really what gives one a sense of meaning and purpose, is what helps one grow in character. And over time, it's what leads to those deeper, meaningful relationships. When you've worked through the conflicts together, when you've struggled together with the pursuit of a common purpose. And so I think it's a price worth paying, sometimes one we're unwilling to pay. But I think if we take a long-term perspective, that commitment to community really is crucial.
This is Life and Faith, and I'm speaking with Tyler VanderWeele, who, among many other things, is the director of the Human Flourishing Program, and human flourishing is our subject today. An important part of democratic society is a commitment to individual autonomy. That is something we rightly revere as vital in a free society. But what, if anything, has our emphasis on autonomy cost us? Here's Professor VanderWeele.
I think the question of autonomy is a complicated one. I think we have placed a great deal of emphasis on it in the West, and it is important to people. People are willing to give up a lot to have that sense of autonomy, to have that sense of freedom. And I do think it is an important part of human life, but I think there's a balance to be had. And I think when we're participating in community, there needs to be some deference to others and to the community norms and to the good of the community, to the common good. Getting that balance right, I think, can be challenging, but it is critical. Again, I think studies indicate that maximizing freedom, maximizing autonomy, simply doing whatever you feel like you want does not, in the long run, lead to happiness. And I think there's something beautiful about kind of freely giving up some autonomy for the sake of the common good, for the sake of the other. And when we do that, I tend to think we flourish more and others around us flourish more.
Can you give me an example of, let's say a young person's listening and they think, what would be an example of how I might do that very thing?
In our research, what has clearly emerged over our own work and decades of prior work, as well as several communities in particular, seem to powerfully contribute to all these different aspects of flourishing. And from a kind of a review in the literature that we published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, USA, kind of point to four: work, education, family, and religious community. And I think, in fact, each of these involves giving up some autonomy. It involves making a set of commitments. When you think about work, that's probably the easiest one to think about, but often you're committing to 40 or sometimes more hours a week, where your decisions are largely shaped by the goals of the organization. And that yet gives people often a sense of meaning and a set of relationships. But the same is the case, I think, in family life, in marriage, for example. That commitment to love the other person until death do us part.
Yeah, it's
a giving up a lot of autonomy.
Yeah.
With the possibility of children, that likewise is giving up a lot of autonomy, but yet also a sense of deep, meaningful relationships, opportunities to really grow and be transformed, a deep sense of meaning and purpose as well. And some of the work we're doing globally right now, there actually seems to be a pretty strong relationship between fertility rates and purpose in life, which has been quite striking. So we're still trying to unpack this, but again, I think that commitment to family, that giving up some autonomy within the context of family life and marriage is another source. Same with religious community, committing to church, for example, does entail showing up regularly, does entail trying to live life according to the teachings that are put forward, entails trying to love and serve others. That likewise requires a giving up of some autonomy. And yet, all these research studies indicate that such weekly participation is associated over time with greater levels of happiness, better health, greater levels of meaning, and better, deeper relationships. So it's a bit paradoxical, but that giving up of autonomy for the sake of a community, for the common good, is what enables flourishing.
The sort of work you're doing is looking at huge, very often longitudinal studies of the effect of all sorts of different things on people. It's not just, some random quick sample that you're doing. I'm interested in your sense of that as a person who looks at these huge patterns of human behavior and how that then affects the way you see the world.
We are looking at very large data sets. Our largest to date is a global flourishing study that we've launched with Gallup. Over 200,000 individuals in 22 different countries, nationally representative sampling in each country. We're following this group of 200,000 individuals once a year for 5 years to try to study and understand the distribution and determinants of disease and control for all these different factors. And so it's exciting. We learn a lot. We get insight into what brings about flourishing. And also, how does this vary across countries and across cultures? What's universal? What's culturally specific? And so it's led to, I think, a lot of really interesting and for some, paradoxical results. I come across many people who are surprised about the strong associations between religious participation and health and well-being later in life. But I think it's important to remember that behind every one of those data points, each of those 200,000 people we have in our study is a human life, is a human person, is a complicated human person with a life journey, a life story, with life unfolding. And so while, again, I think these big data sets can give tremendous insight, it's also the case that we do need to understand people's life stories. And so while, yes, we might find these associations between religious participation and health, if you actually look at what's taking place, sometimes it's a person coming from a place of despair and finding a set of close relationships or a new meaning. Sometimes it's someone struggling with alcohol or drug addiction who feels that they've been freed. Sometimes it's a person who's just been in the same community for 50 years and has this deep network of friendships, of volunteering, of service. So each person has a unique story, and what these data analyses are doing is just sort of averaging over everything that's out there. It allows us to see patterns, but it does hide that life story, which I think we also need to understand if we're to understand flourishing.
You have, let's say, uncovered a whole lot of interesting material about the effect of marriage, the effect of commitment to a religious community. I wonder if people might sense in your articulation of this, and therefore be a bit unsure. They might sense, is this someone trying to pull us back to a kind of the 1950s or something? A previous idealized picture of life that we've kind of broken free from. Do you ever get that kind of reaction? And if so, what do you say in response?
Yeah, I mean, occasionally, certainly those perspectives will come up. And, I tend to think as a society, things, naturally take on developments, and we see changes, and society alters, and some of that's within our control. As individuals, some of that's, of course, not. Some of those changes are going to be good, and some are probably not going to be good. And I do think as a human community, as a human society, we need to recognize where we've perhaps made mistakes and correct. And I do think both with regard to marriage and with regard to religious participation, the current trends have probably not been helpful with regard to well-being. I think there's a reason that those institutions of marriage and of religion have been around so long and have contributed so much. And I think when we, certainly may not be for everyone, but I think when we move as a society away from them, away from what for millennia have benefited so many, we shouldn't anticipate positive effects on well-being. And so I think we need to do some deep thinking with regard to how can we support these institutions of marriage, of religion. And in the case of an individual, might I be too scared of giving up some autonomy for both the greater good and also for my own flourishing? So, I tend to push back against those sorts of reactions and turn things around and question whether we've actually been heading in the right direction in this regard.
A couple of things with that. So someone who's not religious and feels no sense of the divine or that kind of spiritual aspect of life, they might go, well, that's great that people get benefit from that, but I just don't have that. It's not my thing.
Yeah, so I do think it's the case. I'll say a couple of things. First, I do think it's the case that that other forms of community life can be important. And while the data indicate that religious service attendance tends to have more powerful effects than other forms of community life, other forms of community life are powerful as well. So if you're not going to engage in religious life, then find other forms of community, maybe an arts community, maybe a volunteering community, but something that is meeting regularly with a common sense of purpose and shared values, maybe with a history that extends beyond the life of an individual. It's these sorts of communities that I think contribute substantially. But the second thing I would say is I do think it is worth spending some time thinking about the big questions in life. Why are we here? What happens after death? Are there things that I care about so much that I'd be willing to give my life up for? How do I make sense of my own identity, of the universe? What do I make of good and evil? And I think these questions are ones that the world religions have tried to provide answers to, answers that can be rejected, but answers that I think are worth exploring. I tend to think in the contemporary West, many people haven't examined and rejected, but simply haven't examined at all. And so what I would say is I would encourage that deeper exploration. That search. Don't set aside the existential questions. Face them head on.
What about marriage? What are the particular benefits of it to a society? What's it bringing to the table that people might pay attention to?
Yeah, so again, our studies have indicated, and those of others as well, that marriage versus being single tends to lead to higher levels of happiness, greater sense of meaning, greater sense of social connectedness, less loneliness, and probably a 20-30% reduction in mortality risk over 10 years as well. The effect sizes actually aren't quite as large as they are with religious community, but still fairly substantial and meaningful. But I think an even larger societal contribution of marriage beyond kind of the benefit to spouses is the benefit to children. Right. The effect sizes there are even larger in many studies.
I wonder for people who are listening to both your promotion of religious communities and marriage, for those who've been in both of those institutions and been harmed by them, where it's actually not been good, I wonder what we could say to that person.
Yeah, I mean, in these studies, it's important to remember that what we have is averages. What we know is participation in these institutions is on average beneficial and strongly beneficial, but that does not mean that that's everyone's experience. And certainly there can be difficult, abusive marriages which one shouldn't remain in. Likewise, the church and other religious communities has a sad history of abuse, and many have been harmed by what's taken place there. And I think those things need to be acknowledged. We need to do what we can to prevent this and also to seek healing for those who have been harmed. I don't think the right response is to abandon these institutions altogether. Again, on average, they're doing tremendous good, and if we do abandon them, it will do tremendous harm to society. But I do think it's important to seek to reform them, to seek to address abuse in the church, to seek justice, to carry out prevention, to carry out healing. You know, in the context of marriage, I do think resources to help people who are struggling before things seem so bad that divorce seems like the only option. There's now pretty good evidence-based marital counseling, even online marital counseling programs, which are much less expensive and perhaps much less embarrassing, that, again, can help work through some of these difficulties. Won't work for everyone, but I think kind of promotion of the resources that are necessary to work through the difficulties, whether that's in married life or in the church or in other settings, is really quite critical. But I do think we have a tendency today to kind of tear down institutions when we find any fault in them. And I don't think that is the right response. Reform, yes, but abandonment, no. And so I think if we are going to continue to flourish as a society, we need a strong commitment to trying to do what we can to support and to reform these institutions that do so much good.
As we think about flourishing, I want to ask you about suffering and what part that plays in the equation as we weigh this up. And as part of that, what does religion offer in the face of this very real aspect of human existence?
So suffering is sometimes taken as an antonym of flourishing, and I don't think that's quite right. I do think suffering always indicates some absence of flourishing, something not going quite well, but suffering can be compatible, I think, with a profound flourishing. Again, flourishing is multidimensional, so one can be suffering in some ways and flourishing in others. And sometimes those challenges, those moments of suffering can, in fact, lead to a very profound growth and flourishing, a growth in character, a finding of new meanings, an investment, a deeper investment in relationships. It's not easy. I don't want to downplay the difficult situations many people find themselves in, but approached in the right way, I think it can be a profound source of transformation. And I think religious perspectives offer a way to understand and make sense of and find meaning in suffering, both in suffering that we aren't seeking and that comes to us, seeing that growth in character or even that turning to God is ultimately of greater importance than what we may be struggling with at present, provides a community that offers support during those times of suffering, during those trials. And then I think it even allows for an understanding of perhaps voluntarily taking on suffering for the sake of others. I'll often use flourishing and well-being interchangeably in much of my talking and writing, but when I try to distinguish the two, I talk about well-being as all aspects of a person's life are good as they pertain to the individual.
Yep.
Whereas flourishing is all aspects of a person's life are good, including the contexts and communities in which they live. So the community's well-being is part of one's own flourishing. And understood that way, one can make sense of trying to take on big projects which are going to compromise one's happiness, maybe one's health, and may cost one in terms of relationships as well, but one's doing it for the common good. One's trying to improve the community around oneself, and the community's well-being, being a part of one's own flourishing, I think can help make sense of that. With regard to Christianity specifically, we see suffering in some ways right at the heart of the religion of Christianity. They are with Jesus on the cross. I had a Jewish colleague who recently asked me, was Jesus flourishing on the cross? I immediately responded yes, but then for the next week, I kind of struggled with this question. How do I make sense of this? But if, as Christians, we believe that on the cross Jesus did bring salvation to the world, then although there was tremendous suffering there on the cross, his contribution to the world and his example of love, the effect that has had on all subsequent generations is so powerful, so profound, that I think it is reasonable to say that Jesus was flourishing on the cross. His contribution to the community's well-being, to the world's well-being, was part of his own flourishing.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart. Thanks so much to Tyler VanderWeele for his work and for sharing some of that with us today. And thanks to the Scots College for giving us some of Professor VanderWeele's time. He was here in Australia as a guest of Scots and to do their Clark lecture. Please send this episode to a friend you think might enjoy it. Tell them about life and faith and why their week is just incomplete without it. And thanks to our producer, the effervescent Alan Douthwaite. Next week.
I think for writers, writing is much more important than the talking about the writing, because that's what we love to do. At the same time, talking about the writing and the books and the storytelling is very important, particularly in this time where it is very difficult to know what the truth is.